Welcome to Shaping the Future. In this episode, I'm speaking with Dr Sebastian Rosier about his work studying the tipping points in Antarctica's Pine Island Glacier. Antarctica is of course absolutely huge, and the Pine Island Glacier is just one part of it. If Pine Island collapsed into the ocean, it would raise sea levels by several meters, which would be catastrophic for many coastal areas around the world. Sebastian discusses his view of whether we have crossed this tipping point that is part of the complex system being impacted by billions of tons of carbon pollution we pump into the atmosphere each year. This all highlights that this is the decade we must get to work restoring the biosphere if we are to avoid the consequences of extreme global heating. Thanks for listening to Shaping the Future. Subscribe on any podcast channel or YouTube. The next episode will be on Earth Day, the 22nd of April, discussing how regenerative agriculture has the potential to begin restoring the estimated 50 billion tons of carbon lost from our soils since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Taken to scale, we have the potential to flip the soils from their current carbon source to carbon sink and sequester more carbon than we currently emit annually. Okay, Sebastian, thank you very much for speaking to me today. Can we start just by giving some key facts about the Pine Island Glacier in terms of its size, location, the potential impact on sea level rise if it were to collapse?
Yeah, of course. So Pine Island Glacier is located in West Antarctica. So that's one of the two ice sheets on the Antarctic continent, the western one being the smaller one, but generally considered to be more vulnerable to climate change, at least for the time being. And so Pine Island is located in a region we call the Amundsen Sea embayment. And I think in terms of scale, that's something that I always find very difficult to get across. Many people, I guess, the lucky ones are perhaps familiar with alpine glaciers like those we find in Switzerland and France. And this is really on a very different scale. So we're talking about something which is 2 kilometers thick, 40 kilometers wide in its main trunk. So if you imagine, you're sitting on the top of Snowdonia, you've still got another kilometer of ice above you, and it drains an area. So we think of glaciers like this almost like rivers draining the Antarctic ice sheet, and its drainage basin, the region which it drains, is about 175,000 square kilometers, which doesn't mean much, but that's about twice the size, twice the area of Austria. That's maybe the most relatable area I can think of.
Quite substantial.
Exactly, yeah. So it flows, it transports the ice from the mainland, from the interior of the ice sheet at about 4 kilometers a year. So relatively fast by Antarctic standards. And in total, it accounts for about 10% of the ice that drains from the West Antarctic ice sheet. It's by no means the largest glacier in Antarctica, but certainly a very large one. And in terms of sea level rise, it's a bit difficult to give a direct number. I guess these things are always less simple than you might like. So you could, for example, just give the volume of the glacier and then dump that into the ocean and say this is what will happen to sea level rise. But in reality, things are more complicated than that, especially because as it retreats, it will interact with the neighboring glaciers, which will also be adding to that. So I think a simpler thing to think about is what might happen if Pine Island were to collapse in terms of the whole ice sheet, because that's much easier to quantify. And in that sense, there are many studies which have shown that if Pine Island Glacier were to collapse, which is one of the scenarios we're talking about in our work, that could then lead to a collapse of the entire West Antarctic ice sheet. And then we're talking about 3.3-ish meters of sea level rise in total, obviously over a long period of time, but that would be the eventual contribution in sea level.
So it's more of a system that if it did go, it sort of has all these interactions.
It has, exactly, yeah.
And 3.5 meters, I mean, that's pretty catastrophic for the way we live.
Totally. I think sometimes I find people, when I talk to them about this, don't have a particularly strong reaction to that number. And I think maybe it's misleading because you think, well, 3.5 meters, I mean, in many places around the world, the tide goes up and down by 3.5 meters. So that's not particularly impressive. But it actually would constitute a very dramatic change in the coast around many parts of the world. And we're talking about a proportion of the world population, hundreds of millions of people who could be displaced by even some amount of sea levels like that. So it is a pretty dramatic amount.
Yeah, well, just for so many reasons, from agriculture to
Exactly.
cities based on the sea. Your study focuses on a tipping point that you refer to marine ice sheet instability. Can you define this term and the characteristics of ice sheet instability?
Yeah, so the marine ice sheet instability is a term that was coined some time ago to describe, as you say, this instability in the ice sheet. And West Antarctica is particularly vulnerable potentially to this. West Antarctica is something we call a marine ice sheet, and that means that the vast majority of West Antarctica rests on bedrock, which is well below sea level. So in some cases, 2 kilometers below sea level. And what that means is it makes it vulnerable to this mechanism whereby if a glacier goes out of balance, so by balance, I mean, if a glacier is to be in a steady state, then the mass going in must equal the mass going out. And in that case, then everything's fine. If it's out of balance, so if the mass going out is greater than the mass going in, then the glacier will retreat and shrink. And with a marine ice sheet instability, what can happen for a marine ice sheet is that if you were to retreat the glacier for some reason, that retreat could lead to a positive feedback where the amount of ice flowing out continues to increase the more you retreat it. And so it leads to this sort of runaway effect, something we call a tipping point. And this positive feedback that we call as tipping point is the key part of the work I've been doing recently, because it's really quite distinct from other types of behavior which we might be more familiar with. So the classic analogy with a tipping point, I'll just quickly give that, is a canoe. So you're paddling along and you're rocking the canoe, and generally the canoe's going to return back to floating on its keel. And it might happen that you rock it just enough and then suddenly the whole canoe will flip over and capsize. And it just needs that little tiny bit more than it's happy to do, and then it will flip over. And the point about once it capsizes is that flipping it back on its keel becomes very difficult. And to extend that analogy to a glacier, so if a glacier has no tipping point, you can perturb a glacier, for example, by warming the climate, and it might retreat and shrink. But then if you were to reverse that and reverse the climate change, the glacier would regrow in a way directly proportional to what it had lost. But if you cross a tipping point, then once that glacier's retreated, it becomes much, much harder to recover what you've lost. I mean, effectively, it's not really possible unless you were to really, really cool the climate. So that's what we're concerned about with Pine Island Glacier and other glaciers around West Antarctica, is that if we do cross one of these tipping points, that the amount of sea level we're committing to in the future becomes effectively irreversible. And it's a long-term commitment, but it's one that we can't come back from.
And when we're talking about the threshold, that tipping moment, and you're talking about the glacier, you're talking about, let's say, ice freezing and melting, and then if it doesn't freeze so much, then you're starting to see the conditions arise where you start moving towards the tipping point. Because you're losing more mass than you're out of balance, basically. Is that correct?
Yeah, so specifically in this region, the mechanism we're worried about is increased ocean melting. So we believe that as you melt the glacier from underneath, because these glaciers have these large ocean cavities that reach deep into the coastline, and there's relatively warm water available there which can melt the glacier from underneath. So if the glacier melts through that mechanism, then that can start this retreat process. And then from there, once you cross this tipping point, then the marine ice sheet instability might kick in which case the glacier will continue to retreat under its own steam without requiring any further changes in temperature or ocean conditions.
Okay. And you've suggested that there are early warning indicators that could tell us that the Pine Island Glacier is approaching a tipping point. What do these early warning indicators look like, and how have you been able to identify them?
Yeah, so the type of tipping point which for the marine ice sheet instability sort of is categorized as, it's something, a technical term is a fold bifurcation. And one of the incredible things that was discovered in the 80s is that these fold bifurcations exhibit this specific behavior as they approach a tipping point. And it's something that's been termed critical slowing. And essentially all it means is that as the system, whatever that system might be, approaches a tipping point, it will start to respond more sluggishly to any changes. So, for example, in the case of a glacier, as it would approach a tipping point, the changes in the properties of a glacier in response to the climate might become slower and slower as you get to that tipping point. And I think the remarkable thing about this is it's a completely general property of this kind of tipping point. So you can see this similar behavior, or it's been shown before all sorts of tipping points, like the onset of epileptic seizures, banking, stock market crashes, wildlife population collapses. It's, I think, a really incredible thing, and one that wasn't applied previously to glaciers with this particular method. So we sort of take advantage of that and look for this critical slowing in our model. And what that actually means in practice is we push the glacier towards a tipping point by warming the ocean. And we look at changes in the flux of ice, so how much ice is crossing into the ocean. This is something which sort of shows quite a lot of variability. And we track the variability in that flux in our model. And you can see that as you approach a tipping point, the change in flux from one step to the next becomes less. So it starts to change more gradually as you're pushing it towards that tipping point. So you can use statistical tools to detect this change in the response time of the glacier. And then not only can you use that to establish that possibly you're approaching a tipping point, but you can also try and pinpoint when that tipping point will happen, because this change reaches some critical threshold at which point the tipping point would be crossed. So we use this in our study to show that Pine Island Glacier actually has 3 tipping points, not just one. The first 2 being relatively small in terms of total sea level contribution, and the third one being leading to a complete collapse of the glacier.
Is it possible to identify the conditions that would trigger the first tipping point?
Yeah. So
I mean, in the actual glacier.
Yeah. So that's a tricky question, I think. So it's in the early days of using these kind of indicators. And so specifically in terms of using early warning indicators, I think right now we're not there. It's a case of finding a data set that would be appropriate in terms of how long the record is, how accurately you can measure the state of a glacier back in time. And in terms of modeling, which is I guess what is mostly used presently to look at the future of Pine Island Glacier, it's also difficult to say. The glacier, when you model it, tends to be extremely sensitive to your initial conditions. So if we set the glacier up for the present day, it's really unhappy about staying where it is. And so what often happens actually is that this first tipping point, which we identify, is immediately crossed no matter what. We just set the model up in the present day, run it forwards, and immediately we'll cross that first tipping point. Now, as I said, that first tipping point is relatively small in terms of sea level, but it is an irreversible retreat. So in terms of the first tipping point, it's within the errors of the model, I would say, to decide whether or not we've already crossed it or not. But if we haven't already crossed it, it's very close.
Wow. Blimey, that's quite important, isn't it? I mean, that means there's a chance that we're on our way towards the second tipping point within this quite massive system.
Now, of course, yeah. As I said, the final collapse of Pine Island, which would be after the third tipping point, that is still some way away in terms of the present state of the climate, we believe.
Okay. If the interaction of the ocean currents with the ice sheet are the key to the ice sheet's survival, how much do we understand about these ocean currents and how they might respond to further anthropogenic warming or other systems, their own tipping points maybe?
Yeah. So that's something I think we've made a lot of progress. The scientific community has made a lot of progress on in the last few years, actually. And it's much more complex than just climate change leads to warming oceans, which then melts the glacier faster. So actually in the Amundsen Sea region, neighboring Pine Island, we think the mechanism really at play here is a change in what we call the thermocline depth. So that's the depth at which the warm water, which sits below the cold water on top, the depth at which that sits. So that depth moves up and down, and we believe that happens largely as a function of the strength of winds off the coast. And in turn, the strength of those coastal winds is linked to, we believe, tropical Pacific sea surface temperatures through these atmospheric teleconnections. It's all stuff completely out of my my field, but really cool stuff. So again, it's all linked in very tightly in rather complicated ways. But I do think our understanding of that has grown a lot in recent years. And you mentioned actually ocean tipping points. Now, that's something that's also in recent years been looked into around Antarctica. And there's one interesting case in particular, not in this region, but in a neighboring region of West Antarctica, where we do believe that there is also a tipping point in the ocean, whereby, again, changes in winds could lead to a vast region of a floating portion of the ice sheet, which currently sits in cold water, so it doesn't melt very much at all. There could be a tipping point in the ocean, which would then drive this ice shelf to become exposed to very warm water, similar to what we see in Pine Island. And this is a much larger area than the Amundsen Sea, so potentially has a much more dramatic impact on sea levels, both for West Antarctica and East Antarctica.
And presumably that spike in temperature just causes quite a massive doesn't mean anything, but a large acceleration of the heating. It just seems like a fully dynamic system when you've got all of this stuff going on. How would you state the level of certainty of the risk of crossing, whether we've crossed the first one or not, let's say, the first two tipping points as it stands at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, my own personal view, I think, I think it's we're still not quite being at the point where we can say rigorously what that is. But my own personal view, which is not based on concrete scientific facts, but I guess coming from a great deal of time modeling this glacier, is that certainly the first one, I think it's likely we're close or have crossed it, and the second one is not far after that. It wouldn't require a particularly big push to send it over the second one. And as you pointed out, once we've crossed those first two tipping points, then the glacier reaches this configuration where it could then become vulnerable to this final collapse. So I'm not sure I would want to give a level of certainty on that, but it's not particularly far away, I would say.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to sort of commit on that kind of certainty level, but it's just indicative of the risk. And I'm trying to also gauge this sort of time between the first, the second, and then the third. Do you do the first two tipping points and then you have a bit of a nice century break, or is it no, they're just successive? I mean, is there any indication from the models of what that looks like?
Yeah, so certainly I would say the first two tipping points are relatively close to one another and don't require a particularly large push to get them. The third tipping point, which leads to a collapse of the glacier, is further away in terms of how big a push you need to give it in terms of ocean warming, for example, to send the glacier over that tipping point. So I wouldn't be surprised necessarily if we cross the first or even the second tipping point in my lifetime, but I think the third one, we're talking about a longer commitment, more continued emissions over a longer period of time to get to that point. But certainly, if nothing changes in the next generation or two, then we're heading that direction.
Okay, and I mean that just what you've said then kind of ties in with my last question, really, which is how do you view the risk versus current response to this and similar thresholds in the climate system?
Yeah. I find it incredibly frustrating, actually, and maybe I'm going off on a tangent now, that the incredibly clear scientific consensus that exists is not communicated effectively to the general public. Somehow there's something breaking down in between, and I've spoken to many people. If someone asks me what I do, and I explain to them I'm working in this sort of climate change research, I always get the same response, which is, that's interesting. So is it all real then? And I find it extraordinary that we're still at that point. And of course, that's not, I'm sure there are many, many people out there who are not there. But my experience is that we're still at that point where people don't realize the level of consensus in the scientific community about these topics. And I think there's a real issue with people losing faith in the scientific method and the way we do our work. I think in terms of Antarctica, there's another problem, which is that people hear these numbers like, currently millimeters of sea level rise per year and centuries of melt. And they think, well, I mean, that really doesn't sound very, concerning to me. And I think that's the point of the study and the tipping point. The specific nature of tipping points is that, as I said earlier, once we cross these, then it's not a question of then realizing our mistake and being able to come back from that. You really have then gone into this phase of irreversible retreat, and we're committing future generations, future generations, having to deal with this problem. So I don't think the global response to this threat is anywhere near enough. But I guess I also understand perhaps why it's difficult to view this as a serious problem now rather than something we can deal with later.
I think in the last few years, climate impacts have become more tangible in terms of, these sort of more extreme impacts that you see in terms of fires. I think science now links Arctic sea ice loss to changes of jet stream behavior and things like that are starting to trickle through. And I think there's a thirst for knowledge if it's presented in a sort of not in a science paper way, perhaps. I think that is changing now. I think people are starting to realize that we're at risk of losing so much of the world as we enjoy it, as many of us enjoy it. And I know a lot of people.
I hope so. I really hope. I certainly think movements like Greta Thunberg have really helped with that in recent years. So yeah. I like your optimism. I hope you're right.
I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. I'll just say I think that the public messaging's changing. But well, look, thank you very much. It's been really interesting and insightful to understand that.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.